Negative, Spectre. I repeat, negative. That is a non-viable solution. Lieutenant Commander Miller's voice cracked through the secure channel, distorted by the static of the ionic storm raging around the peaks. The wind howled like a dying animal, tearing at the rocky outcrop where she lay prone. "Target is acquiring the convoy," Elena whispered, her voice steady, betraying none of the tremors rattling the mountain. Her cheek pressed against the freezing polymer stock of her rifle. "He is 3,800 meters out. If he enters the tunnel complex, we lose him for another decade." 3.8 kilometers is physics-defying, Vance. "You are just wasting ammunition and giving away our position," Miller shouted, the sound of returning fire echoing in his background. "My men are pinned down in the valley. We need covering fire on the ridge, not a miracle shot at a ghost. Pack up and move to extraction point Alpha. That is a direct order." Elena did not move. Her world had shrunk to the reticle of her scope and the dancing numbers of the atmospheric sensors. The wind was pushing right to left at 40 miles per hour. The air density was thin enough to make blood boil. The Coriolis effect at this latitude would pull the bullet significantly off course over such a distance. "Spectre, acknowledge." "Correction, Commander," Elena murmured, her finger taking up the slack on the trigger. She slowed her heart rate until it beat once every 2 seconds. "The wind has shifted. I have the solution." She exhaled, emptying her lungs completely. The world went silent. 48 hours earlier, forward operating base. Highland, northern border. The Pelican hard case was the size of a small coffin, and judging by the strain on the 4 soldiers attempting to navigate around it in the cramped briefing room, weighed nearly as much. It sat on the metal table, a matte black monolith amidst the scattering of tactical maps and tablet computers. "Is there a body in there?" Chief Petty Officer Davis asked, leaning against the bulkhead, his arms crossed over a chest broad enough to stop shrapnel. A ripple of low laughter moved through the 6 men of SEAL Team 6. "Just the Reaper's scythe," a soft voice answered from the doorway. The laughter died instantly. Every head turned. Ensign Elena Spectre Vance stood at the threshold of the briefing room. She looked nothing like the Reaper. She looked, to put it charitably, like a librarian who had taken a wrong turn into a war zone. Standing barely 5'4", with pale skin that seemed almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights of the forward operating base, she was dwarfed by the sheer physical mass of the men in the room. Her uniform was clean, too clean, and her eyes, a striking, unsettling shade of ash gray, scanned the room with a predator's detachment. Lieutenant Commander James Miller, a man whose face was a map of past conflicts, frowned. He looked from the woman to the file in his hand, then back to the woman. "Vance," Miller said, the name tasting like spoilt milk in his mouth. "Headquarters said they were sending a heavy hitter for the Overwatch element. I assumed—" "You assumed a man, sir," Elena finished for him, stepping into the room. She moved with a fluid, silent grace that didn't match her heavy boots. She walked straight to the black case on the table. "You assumed someone who can bench press a truck. You didn't assume you'd get the person who wrote the current manual on high-altitude ballistics correction." Miller's jaw tightened. "Listen, Ensign. We are going up to 4,000 meters. The air is thin, the terrain is vertical, and the enemy is relentless. I don't need a mathematician. I need a shooter who can hump 70 pounds of gear up a goat trail without needing a medevac." "My gear weighs 90 pounds, Commander," Elena said. Her hands moved over the latches of the case. Click, click, click. The sound was rhythmic, precise. She threw the lid open. Inside lay the Chetak M200 intervention, a weapon that looked less like a rifle and more like an artillery piece designed for personal use. It was stripped down, the cold steel and carbon fiber gleaming darkly. The barrel was fluted and impossibly long. The scope was a customized beast of optics that cost more than Miller's car. The room went silent. The men knew hardware, and this was hardware designed for one thing: reaching out and touching someone from a different zip code. "Pretty toy," Davis muttered, though the mockery had lost its edge. "Bit heavy for a girl, isn't it?" Elena didn't look at him. She picked up the bolt assembly, inspecting it with fingers that were slender but calloused. "It's not a toy, Chief. It's a surgical instrument. And as for the weight—" She looked up, locking eyes with Miller. "I don't carry it with my muscles, sir. I carry it with my will. You worry about the door kickers. Let me worry about the long wind." Miller stared at her for a long moment, assessing. He saw the defiance, yes, but he also saw something else: a stillness, a terrifying, absolute stillness that he had only seen in men who had been in the bush too long. "We roll out at 0400, Miller said finally, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "Don't slow us down, Spectre. If you lag more than 50 meters behind, we leave you for the wolves." "Understood," Elena said. She began to assemble the rifle, her movements a blur of efficiency. She knew they didn't want her there. She knew they saw a liability. But as she slid the massive bolt into the receiver with a solid clunk, Elena Vance allowed herself a rare, faint smile. They thought the mountain was their enemy. They thought the terrorists were the threat. They didn't realize that the most dangerous thing on that mountain was going to be the small woman watching over them from the clouds. She would let them keep their doubts. Silence, after all, was where she did her best work. The insertion was a violent affair. The MH-47 Chinook hovered just feet above the jagged scree of the ridgeline, its twin rotors churning the freezing air into a frenzy of ice crystals and dust. The ramp dropped, and the team surged out into the darkness, moving with the practiced aggression of apex predators entering a new hunting ground. Elena was the last one off the ramp. The weight of her ruck, combined with the Pelican case she had insisted on strapping to her frame rather than hand-carrying, brought her total load to nearly 100 pounds. As her boots hit the uneven shale, the rotor wash threatened to sweep her off the mountain. She dropped her center of gravity, digging in, her body angled sharply against the gale until the helicopter lifted off and banked away, plunging them into sudden, ringing silence. "Move out. Ranger file. Double time to waypoint, Charlie." Miller's voice cut through the comm's earpiece, devoid of warmth. "Let's see who did their cardio." It was a challenge, undisguised and blunt. Waypoint Charlie was 5 clicks away and 600 meters up a vertical ascent. At this altitude, the air was already thin enough to make a healthy man gasp after climbing a flight of stairs. Miller was setting a pace designed to break her within the first hour. The line of 6 men moved efficiently, their night vision goggles casting the treacherous terrain in shades of phosphor green. Elena took the rear guard position. The path was barely a goat trail, winding along the edge of a sheer drop that fell away into black nothingness. 30 minutes in, the burn started. It wasn't just the lactic acid in her thighs. It was the hypoxia. Her lungs heaved, trying to pull oxygen from air that felt like dry ice. Every breath was a conscious labor. She employed the pressure-breathing technique she had mastered years ago, sharp exhalations through pursed lips to force open the alveoli in her lungs. Inhale. Step. Exhale. Step. She watched the heat signatures of the men ahead of her. They were struggling too, though they hid it well. The heavy panting over the open comms channel was the only betrayal of their facade. Miller pushed them relentlessly, skipping rest breaks, his eyes likely glued to his rear-view monitor, waiting for Elena to drop to a knee. She didn't drop. She became a machine. The heavy rifle on her back was a crushing burden, the straps biting into her shoulders, but she welcomed the pain. Pain was focus. The trail narrowed as they skirted a massive limestone outcropping. The ground here was treacherous, loose slate over hard ice. Suddenly, the heat signature directly in front of her lurched. It was Davis. The big man had stepped on an unstable slab. The rock gave way with a sickening grind. His boot slipped, his heavy frame twisting as gravity claimed him. He scrabbled silently at the smooth rock face, sliding toward the edge of the precipice. There was no time to shout. Elena didn't think. She reacted. She dropped to one knee, slamming her body weight backward against the mountain wall to anchor herself. Her left hand shot out, grabbing the drag handle on the back of Davis's tactical vest just as his boots went over the edge. The jolt was tremendous. 240 pounds of steel and gear yanked at her arm, threatening to dislocate her shoulder. Her boots skidded 6 inches toward the abyss, grinding sparks against the stone. But she stopped. For a second, they hung there in the freezing dark, Davis dangling over a 1,000-foot drop, held up only by the grip of the woman he had mocked 2 days ago. "Got you," she hissed through gritted teeth, the strain evident in her voice. Leveraging her lower center of gravity and the sheer friction of her heavy pack, she hauled back. She pulled with everything she had, her core muscles screaming. Davis found a purchase with one boot, and together they heaved him back onto solid ground. Davis lay on his back for a moment, chest heaving, staring up at the starless sky. He turned his head to look at Elena. Through the green glow of the night vision, she could see the wide-eyed shock on his face. He looked at her arm, then at the edge, processing the physics of what had just happened. "Clear the kill zone," Miller barked from the front, unaware of the near-death experience in the rear. "Why are we stopping?" Davis keyed his mic, his voice shaky but controlled. "Gear adjustment, boss. We're good. Moving." He stood up, offering a hand to help Elena rise. She ignored it, pushing herself up with her rifle stock. "Thanks," Davis whispered, the word barely audible over the wind. It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission. "Watch your footing, Chief," Elena replied flatly. "I'm not carrying you down." She checked her gear, adjusted her straps, and signaled him to move. The march continued, but the dynamic in the rear of the column had shifted. The wind howled louder as they neared the 3,000-meter mark, carrying with it the first stinging needles of the approaching storm. The separation from the main assault force was brief and conducted in total silence. While Lieutenant Commander Miller led the rest of the team down into the shadows of the ravine to approach the target village from the ground, Elena turned her face toward the sky, or rather, toward the black, jagged tooth of rock that scraped the belly of the passing clouds, Point Zulu. Miller had assigned Chief Petty Officer Davis to be her spotter. It was a tactical decision layered with punitive intent, punishment for Davis for slipping on the trail, and a shackle for Elena to ensure she did not go rogue. Davis carried the spotting scope and the encrypted radio relay, his face grim as he fell in behind her. He did not complain, but the set of his jaw suggested he would rather be kicking down doors in the valley than freezing on a summit. The final 1,000 meters of ascent was not a hike. It was a vertical crawl. They moved hand over hand up the chimney of the mountain, the air growing thinner with every meter. The temperature plummeted, turning the moisture on their gear into stiff rime ice. Elena moved deliberately, testing every handhold, her breathing rhythmic and shallow to conserve heat and oxygen. The Chaytak rifle strapped to her back felt like a second spine, heavy and unforgiving, pulling her center of gravity backward over the abyss. When they finally crested the ridge of Point Zulu, the wind hit them with the force of a physical blow. It was a chaotic, swirling gale that screamed over the razor edge of the peak. Davis pulled himself up onto the small shelf of rock, his chest heaving. He scanned the area with his night vision monocular and shook his head, shouting over the roar of the wind. "This is no good, Vance. It is too exposed. The wind shear up here will throw any projectile off by yards. We need to drop down to the secondary ledge 50 meters below." Elena ignored him. She unclipped her pack and crawled to the very lip of the precipice. The drop was absolute, a sheer vertical fall that disappeared into the darkness. From here, however, the entire valley system was laid out like a map on a table. She could see the winding access roads, the cluster of compounds that made up the terrorist stronghold, and the escape routes leading to the border. "Negative," Elena said, her voice flat. She didn't shout. She simply pitched her voice under the wind. "The secondary ledge has a blind spot on the northern sector. If they run, they will run north. We stay here." "Are you insane?" Davis crawled closer, grabbing her shoulder. "Look at this wind. You cannot stabilize a shooting platform on a knife edge in a hurricane. We are setting up a fail condition." Elena turned to look at him. The wind whipped stray strands of hair across her face, but her eyes were devoid of fear. In fact, there was a strange tranquility in them that Davis found more unsettling than the height. "I don't fight the wind, Chief. I read it," she said. "This position gives us a 30-degree angle of depression and full coverage of the extraction zones. If we go lower, we are just spectators. I did not haul a 30-pound rifle up here to watch." She pulled away from his grip and began to unpack the Pelican case. Her movements were precise, almost ritualistic. She deployed the bipod, digging the spiked feet into the frozen gravel. She pulled out the Kestrel weather meter, holding it up to sample the chaotic air. Davis stared at her for a long moment, wrestling with his instinct to override her. He outranked her in time in service, if not in commission, and he was a SEAL. But he remembered the grip on his vest 2 hours ago. He remembered the strength in that small arm. With a curse that was lost to the gale, Davis unslung his pack. "If we get blown off this rock, I am haunting you," he grumbled. They spent the next hour constructing the hide. They draped themselves in thermal-blocking blankets and overlaid them with lightweight netting that mimicked the gray shale of the peak. Elena lay prone behind the rifle, her body pressing into the freezing stone until the cold seeped through her mats and into her bones. She adjusted the massive scope, the optics gathering the faint starlight to reveal the valley floor miles away. The world narrowed down to the circle of glass. The wind howled, the rock vibrated beneath them, and the temperature continued to drop. They were no longer soldiers, they were part of the geology. "Comms check," she whispered. 5 by 5, Davis replied, his voice barely a breath in her ear. He settled in beside her, his spotting scope trained on the same sector. Elena slowed her heart. The climb was over. Now began the hardest part of the mission, the waiting. 18 hours on the rock. Time had ceased to be measured in minutes or seconds. It was measured in heartbeats and the slow, creeping numbness that started in the toes and worked its way inward. The cold at 4,000 meters was not passive. It was an aggressive, predatory force. It sought out every seam in the thermal layers, every exposed patch of skin, gnawing at the will to remain motionless. Elena lay prone, her body fused to the freezing earth. She had not moved a muscle significantly since they had established the hide. To an outside observer, she would have appeared dead, a pile of gray rags abandoned on the summit. Only the rhythmic puff of condensed breath escaping the mesh of her face veil betrayed the life within. Beside her, Chief Davis was struggling. He was a frogman, a warrior bred for the explosive violence of door-kicking and underwater demolition. This stagnant, silent warfare was alien to him. Elena could hear his breathing hitch occasionally, the subtle shifting of his weight as he tried to relieve the cramping in his muscles without alerting the sensors of the world below. "Status," Elena whispered. She didn't move her lips. The word was formed in the back of her throat, picked up by the bone conduction mic. "Movement. Negative," Davis replied, his voice raspy from dehydration. "Nothing but goats and wind. My scope is icing up. Clear it. Slowly." Elena took a sip of nutrient gel from the tube running to her collar. It tasted like metallic paste, but it provided the calories needed to keep her body temperature from crashing. She blinked slowly, washing her corneas with moisture. The discipline of the sniper was not in the shooting. It was in the suffering. It was the ability to retreat into one's own mind, to lock away the pain and boredom in a mental box, leaving only the observer behind. The radio crackled, shattering the hypnotic rhythm of the wind. "Spectre, this is Highland Actual," Miller's voice cut through, distorted by the atmospheric interference. "Sitrep." "Highland, this is Spectre," Elena replied softly. "No joy. Sector remains quiet. Continuing observation." "We are burning daylight, Spectre," Miller snapped. "Intel suggests the target moves at dusk. We've been lying in this freezing ravine for half a day. My men are getting restless. If we don't see movement in the next hour, we are moving to the secondary breach point and kicking the door in." Elena's eyes narrowed behind her scope. "Negative Actual. If you breach now, you lose the element of surprise. The valley is a natural amphitheater. One gunshot, and they will scatter into the tunnel network before you cross the perimeter." "I don't need a tactical lecture, Ensign," Miller retorted. "I need a target. You have 60 minutes. If you don't give me a positive ID, we are going kinetic. Miller out." The line went dead. The silence that followed was heavier than before. "He's antsy," Davis murmured. "He hates sitting still. We all do." "Patience keeps you alive, Chief," Elena said. "Impatience gets you a folded flag." She shifted her focus back to the valley floor, 3 miles below. The shadows were lengthening, stretching like dark fingers across the rocky terrain. The sun was dipping below the western peaks, casting the world in a deceptive twilight that played tricks on the eyes. Rock formations looked like men. Swaying bushes looked like vehicles. 40 minutes passed. The cold was now a dull ache in Elena's bones. Her mind began to drift, a dangerous symptom of fatigue, but she snapped it back, forcing herself to scan the sector grid by grid. Sector 1, clear. Sector 2, clear. Sector 3, contact, she whispered. The word was electric. Davis stiffened beside her. "Where?" "Sector 4, North Road, 3 vehicles, black SUVs, high speed." Elena adjusted the magnification on her scope. The image danced slightly in the mirage of the cooling earth, but the shapes were unmistakable. 3 heavy vehicles were winding their way up the valley floor, kicking up trails of dust that glowed orange in the setting sun. They were moving with a purpose that the local goat herders lacked. "I have them," Davis confirmed, his voice tight. "Laser rangefinder is no good. Too much particulate in the air. I can't get a bounce." "Visual estimation," Elena said. She watched the vehicles slow down. They weren't heading for the main compound. They were veering off toward a small, isolated structure at the very far end of the valley, nestled against the base of the opposing cliff face. "They are stopping," Elena said, her pulse remaining steady even as her mind raced to calculate the geometry. "They are not entering the kill zone. They are stopping at the safe house." That's way out there," Davis said, checking his map. "That is outside the mission parameter box." Elena watched as the doors of the middle SUV opened. A figure stepped out, surrounded by armed guards. Even at this distance, the posture was commanding. It was him, the high-value target. "Highland Actual, this is Spectre," Elena broadcasted, her voice cold and clear. "Jackpot, target identified." "Good copy, Spectre." Miller's voice came back, eager now. "Give me a solution. We are moving up." "Wait," Elena said. She looked at the reticle. She looked at the map. She looked at the atmospheric data. The target had stopped at the absolute limit of the valley. "Davis," she said quietly. "What is the range?" Davis fumbled with the map and his compass, triangulating their position relative to the safe house. He paused. He checked it again. He looked at Elena, his face pale in the gloom. "Elena," he said, using her first name for the first time. "That's not a firing solution. That's a zip code. It's over 3.5 clicks." 3.8, Elena corrected, her eyes locked on the tiny figure in the scope. 3,800 meters. 3,800 meters, Davis repeated, the number hanging in the thin air like a curse. He looked from the map to the real world, shaking his head in disbelief. "That is not a shot, Spectre. That is an artillery coordinate." Elena did not respond immediately. Her fingers were already moving across the keypad of her ballistic computer, a ruggedized PDA hardwired to the sensors on her rifle. She punched in the variables: barometric pressure, humidity, spin drift, and the latitude of their position. When she entered the range, the screen blinked red. Out of parameters. The software, designed for standard military engagements, simply refused to calculate a firing solution for a target nearly 2.5 miles away. "Computer is rejecting the solution," Elena said calmly, sliding the device aside. She reached into her vest and pulled out a battered waterproof notebook, her dope, data on previous engagements, book. "Going manual." "Elena, listen to me," Davis hissed, his eye still glued to the spotting scope. "At this distance, the bullet time of flight is going to be over 7 seconds. 7 seconds. The target could walk away, sit down, or get in a car before the round even arrives. If you miss, the sonic crack will alert the entire valley. We will have 200 fighters swarming Miller's position in 10 minutes. I am accounting for the delay," she murmured, flipping pages filled with her own dense, handwritten charts. She looked at the Kestrel wind meter spinning furiously on its tripod. "Wind is varying. 15 miles per hour at the muzzle, full value left to right. But down there in the valley, look at the dust. It is blowing the opposite direction." "Highland Actual to Spectre," Miller's voice barked in her ear, louder this time. "I need a green light or a red light. Can you take the shot?" Elena pressed the transmit button. "Highland, this is Spectre. Target is at 3,800 meters. Computer is down, but I am calculating a manual solution. I require 2 minutes to read the wind currents." There was a long pause on the channel, a silence so profound that Elena could hear the static hissing like a snake. "Say again, Spectre?" Miller's voice came back, slow and dangerously low. "Did you say 3800? Nearly 4 kilometers?" "Affirmative, actual." "Negative," Miller snapped. "Absolutely negative. That is physically impossible. You are not shooting at a target. You are shooting at a prayer. If you take that shot, you compromise the entire operation for an ego trip." Elena felt a flush of heat rise up her neck, but her voice remained ice cold. "Sir, the atmospheric density at this altitude favors the trajectory. The .408 round stays supersonic out to 3,000 yards. I can push it. I have the angle." "I said negative!" Miller shouted, his frustration boiling over. "I am not risking my men on a physics experiment. If the target is that far out, we cannot touch him. We are scrubbing the kinetic option." Elena looked through her scope. The target, the terrorist leader responsible for bombings across 2 continents, was standing by the vehicle smoking a cigarette. He was a tiny speck, a ghost in the crosshairs. In 5 minutes, he would be gone. "Commander," Elena tried one last time, her desperation leaking into her professional tone. "I have the hold. The wind is stabilizing. If we let him go—" "We are not letting him go," Miller interrupted. "We are withdrawing to the extraction point and calling in an airstrike when he moves. We are done here. Pack up your gear and move to Rally Point Alpha. Do not engage. I repeat, weapons tight." "That is a direct order, Ensign." Elena's finger hovered over the trigger guard. The shot was there. She could see it in her mind. The beautiful high arc of the bullet rising over the valley floor, plunging down through the layers of air, correcting for the spin of the earth and striking home. It was a symphony of math and violence waiting to be conducted. But the order had been given. "Spectre copies," she said, the words tasting like ash. "Weapons tight. Withdrawing." She released the breath she had been holding. The tension in her shoulders did not dissipate. It solidified into a heavy stone of resentment. She looked at Davis. "Pack it up," she said, her voice hollow. Davis looked at her with a mixture of relief and sympathy. "It was the right call, Elena. Nobody hits at that range. Nobody." Elena didn't answer. She folded the bipod legs of the Chaytak, the metal cold against her skin. They were wrong. She knew they were wrong. But in the military, being right meant nothing if you didn't have the rank to prove it. She began to disassemble the sight, unaware that the enemy below had already spotted the glint of the SEAL team's movement in the lower valley. The trap was already closing, and the only weapon capable of stopping it was being put back into its case. The silence on the peak was absolute, broken only by the frantic rasp of Velcro and the click of polymer buckles as Chief Davis broke down his observation post. He moved with the hurried efficiency of a man who knew he was lingering too long in a bad neighborhood. "Let's go, Spectre," Davis urged, stuffing his spotting scope into his ruck. Miller sounded serious. "If we aren't at the rally point in 2 hours, he leaves us. You heard him." Elena stood motionless over her rifle. The wind had dropped, leaving behind a heavy, static-charged stillness. The air smelled of ozone and dry dust, the scent of an approaching electrical storm, or perhaps something worse. Her hands were on the weapon, but she wasn't disassembling it. Her fingers traced the cold steel of the barrel, lingering on the muzzle brake. "Spectre?" Davis paused, looking at her. "What are you doing? We are burning daylight." "Something is wrong," Elena murmured. It wasn't insubordination. It was instinct, a nagging, persistent itch at the base of her skull that she had learned never to ignore. Why did the target stop there? Why didn't they drive into the compound? Who cares? Maybe he needed a bathroom break. We have orders. Davis snapped, hoisting his pack. Elena ignored him. She dropped back down behind the scope, ignoring Davis's groan of frustration. She didn't look at the target this time. She looked at the shadows. She looked at the periphery, the places where the eye naturally didn't want to go. She scanned the ridgeline above the valley floor, the area flanking the extraction route that Miller and his team would be taking in less than 20 minutes. At first, there was nothing but gray rock and scrub brush. Then, a rock moved. Elena held her breath. She focused the lens. It wasn't a rock. It was a man, draped in a desert-patterned shawl, moving low and fast along a goat trail that ran parallel to the SEAL's intended path. Then another, then a third, carrying the distinct, tubular outline of an RPG-7 launcher. "Davis," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Look at grid 47, sub-quadrant alpha." "I've packed the scope, Elena. We have to go." "Look with your eyes, damn it," she hissed, the intensity in her voice stopping him cold. Davis dropped to one knee and raised his binoculars. He scanned the area she indicated. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a curse. "I see them," he whispered. 6 packs, moving into an L-shaped ambush position. They are setting up a kill box on the main road. They knew we were coming, Elena realized, a cold knot forming in her stomach. The convoy was bait. They lured Miller in, and now they are closing the door behind him. She reached for the radio PTT, push to talk, on her chest rig. "Highland Actual, this is Spectre. Urgent traffic. Static. Nothing but white noise. Highland, come in. You are walking into a trap. Over." More static. "The storm," Davis said, looking up at the darkening sky. "The ionic interference is scrambling the UHF band. We lost comms with the valley floor." Elena stared at the radio, then back through her scope. Miller and his men were blind. They were walking confidently toward a choke point, where half a dozen RPGs were waiting to turn their withdrawal into a massacre. "We have to go down there," Davis said, panic edging into his voice. "We have to warn them physically." "We will never make it in time," Elena replied. "It's a 3-hour descent. They will be dead in 20 minutes. She looked at her rifle. The physics-defying shot that Miller had forbidden was now the only thing that could reach the battlefield in time. But the order had been clear. Weapons tight. Do not engage. To fire now, especially after being ordered to stand down, would be the end of her career. If she missed, she would be court-martialed for compromising the mission. If she hit, she might still be court-martialed. But if she did nothing, 6 American flags would be draped over 6 coffins. "Help me with the bipod," Elena commanded, her voice changing. The hesitation was gone. The librarian was gone. The Reaper had returned. "Elena, you heard the commander," Davis warned, though his hands were already moving to assist her. "If you take a shot and miss—" "I'm not going to shoot yet," she lied. Or perhaps she was just negotiating with herself. "I'm just adjusting the angle, just in case." She didn't pack the rifle. Instead, she dug the bipod legs deeper into the frozen scree. She extended the elevation knob on the scope to its maximum limit, pushing the mechanics of the weapon to the very edge of its design specifications. She wasn't withdrawing. She was digging in. "Leave the ammo box open, Chief," she said softly, "and get your spotter scope back out. We aren't going anywhere." Through the optic lens of the Chetak intervention, the war below played out like a silent, terrifying film. 3 miles down, the squad of SEALs emerged from the cover of the rock formations, moving in a spaced wedge formation. They were disciplined, their weapons scanning the high ground, but they were looking at the wrong ridge. They were looking for threats within 300 meters, the standard engagement distance for a carbine fight. They were not looking at the scree slope nearly a kilometer above their heads, where the enemy kill team lay prone. "Don't do it," Elena whispered to the tiny figures in her scope. "Don't cross the open ground." But they did. They had to. It was the only route to the extraction point. The first sign of the ambush was not sound, but light. A sudden bright flare erupted from the northern ridgeline, the distinct backblast of an RPG-7 being fired. "Contact front!" Davis shouted, though his warning was futile. The sound would take nearly 15 seconds to reach the valley floor, but light traveled instantly. Elena watched the rocket propel itself downward. It was a smudge of gray smoke against the brown earth, streaking toward the lead element of the SEAL team. It impacted 10 meters in front of the point man. Dust and debris exploded outward in a violent flower. Even from this distance, the concussive force was evident as the soldiers were knocked off their feet like toy soldiers swept by an invisible hand. Then the sound arrived at the peak, a dull, delayed crump followed by the frantic popping of automatic weapons fire. "They are in a complex L ambush," Elena analyzed, her voice detached, reciting the nightmare unfolding before her. "Heavy machine gun at the apex, RPGs on the flank. They are caught in the kill zone." Down in the valley, chaos reigned. The SEALs were professionals. They didn't freeze. They immediately scrambled for the limited cover of the roadside boulders, returning fire with aggressive bursts. Elena could see the muzzle flashes of their MK-18 carbines and the heavier thud of the MK-48 machine gunner trying to suppress the enemy ridge. But they were fighting gravity and geometry. The enemy was dug in high above them, firing down. The SEALs' return fire was impacting harmlessly against the rock face below the enemy positions. "They can't hit them," Davis said, gripping his binoculars so hard his knuckles turned white. "The angle is too steep, and the wind. Look at the tracers." Elena adjusted her scope to follow the trajectory of the SEAL's designated marksman. He was trying to pick off the RPG gunner. She watched the tracer rounds arc upward. To the shooter on the ground, the shot probably looked straight. But halfway to the target, the valley's crosswind caught the lightweight 7.62 mm bullets. They drifted sharply to the left, splashing against the stone yards away from the enemy. The enemy didn't flinch. They knew the wind protected them. They reloaded calmly. Another RPG streak flashed out. This one hit closer to the center of the SEAL formation. "Highland Actual is hit," Davis choked out. "I see a casualty. It looks like Miller." Through the high magnification glass, Elena saw the figure of the lieutenant commander go down, clutching his leg. Another SEAL dragged him behind a rock, but the rock was disintegrating under the hammer blows of a DSHK heavy machine gun. They were pinned. They couldn't move forward, they couldn't retreat, and their weapons couldn't reach the enemy. The radio suddenly crackled to life, breaking through the static with the sheer proximity of panic. "Taking heavy fire. Casualties. We are combat ineffective. Requesting immediate air support." "Negative on air," a distant controller's voice replied, faint and broken. "Storm ceiling is too low. Birds are grounded. You are on your own, Highland." "We are dead down here," someone screamed over the open channel. It wasn't Miller. It was a younger voice, raw with terror. Elena pulled her eye away from the scope for a fraction of a second. She looked at the darkening sky, the indifferent mountains, and the swirling dust. The world was vast and cruel, and it was about to swallow 6 brave men because they had adhered to the laws of physics. But Elena Vance had spent her life studying the exceptions to those laws. "Davis," she said. Her voice was no longer that of a subordinate. It was the voice of the person holding the biggest stick on the battlefield. "Give me the wind reading at the mid-valley thermal layer, now." Davis looked at her, then down at the slaughter, then back at her. The chain of command had evaporated. There was only the problem and the solution. "Wind is shifting," Davis called out, reading the kestrel. "It's turbulent, gusting 20 to 25. "No," Elena said, settling her cheek against the stock. She closed her eyes for a second, feeling the vibration of the mountain against her chest. "It's not random. It's cycling. There is a rhythm." She opened her eyes. The crosshairs settled on the distant ridgeline, where the enemy RPG team was celebrating their impending victory. They thought they were gods, untouchable on their high perch. They were about to learn that there was a higher power on the mountain. The screaming on the radio had turned into a chaotic din of pain and desperate orders, but Elena dialed the volume down until it was nothing more than a background hum. She could not help them yet. Not until she cut the head off the snake. Through the scope, she saw the high-value target moving. The ambush on the SEAL team was merely a diversion, a violent firework display to cover his escape. The man was hurrying toward the armored SUV, his bodyguards casting nervous glances at the sky, unaware that death was already watching them from a place they couldn't conceive. "Davis," Elena said, her voice terrifyingly calm amidst the panic. "Elevation dial is maxed out. I need to hold over. Calculate the drop for 3800. Davis tore his eyes away from the slaughter in the valley. He looked at her, his face streaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature. He realized what she was doing. She wasn't firing at the ambushers yet. She was taking the impossible shot first. "Elena, the drop it's massive," Davis stammered, consulting his tablet, which was finally spitting out raw data. "At that range, you are looking at over 4,000 inches of drop. You have to aim at the clouds to hit the ground." "Give me the hold in mils," she commanded. 127 mils elevation," Davis read out, his voice trembling. "Windage. God, Elena, the wind is full value left. You need to hold off target by 20 feet. Elena adjusted her body. She wasn't just aiming a rifle. She was aligning herself with the rotation of the Earth. At this extreme distance, the Coriolis effect, the spinning of the planet beneath the bullet's flight path, would pull the round to the right. The spin drift of the bullet itself would pull it further. And then there was the wind. She looked at the mirage. The heat waves rising from the valley floor were boiling, shifting direction erratically. To any other sniper, this was a no-shoot scenario. It was gambling. But Elena Vance saw the pattern. She watched the grass on a ridge halfway to the target. It flattened, then stood up, then flattened again. Gust. Lull. Gust. Lull. "There is a rhythm," she whispered to herself. 3 seconds. I have a 3-second window where the crosswind drops to under 5 miles per hour. She settled her cheek against the stock. Her world shrank to the mil dots in her reticle. She placed the target, the chest of the terrorist leader, not in the center of the crosshairs, but deep in the lower quadrant of her scope, compensating for the immense arc the bullet would travel. She aimed high and far to the left, aiming at a patch of empty dirt that looked nothing like a threat. "Target is at the car door," Davis warned. "He is opening it. 2 seconds." "Wait," Elena said. She inhaled. The cold air filled her lungs, sharpening her senses. She felt the pulse in her thumb against the stock. Thump, thump. Too fast. She forced it down. Thump, thump. The wind howled over the ridge, tearing at her ghillie suit. Then, suddenly, the invisible hand of the storm lifted. The grass halfway down the mountain stood still. The window was open. "Send it," Davis whispered, more of a prayer than a command. Elena exhaled, reaching the natural respiratory pause where the body is most stable. Her finger, sensitive to the ounce, applied pressure to the trigger. She didn't pull it. She squeezed it straight back, a movement so subtle it was almost a thought rather than an action. Crack. The Chetak M200 roared. The muzzle brake channeled the expanding gases backward, kicking up a cloud of dust and ice around them. The recoil slammed into Elena's shoulder with the force of a mule kick, but her body absorbed it, rocking back and then immediately forward to reacquire the sight picture. The massive .48 caliber solid copper bullet left the barrel at 3,000 feet per second. It punched through the sound barrier with a sharp snap, beginning its long, lonely journey across the valley. "Shot out," Elena announced. Now she was helpless. The bullet was no longer hers. It belonged to the wind, to gravity, and to fate. 1 second. The bullet was still climbing, reaching the apex of its trajectory, soaring higher than some birds fly. 2 seconds. It began its descent, gravity clawing at its velocity. 3 seconds. Down in the valley, the terrorist leader paused to look at something on his phone, completely unaware that he was already dead. The news just hadn't arrived yet. 4 seconds. The bullet plunged through the turbulent air layers, shedding speed but maintaining its deadly rotation. 5 seconds. Davis held his breath, his eyes glued to the spotting scope. 6 seconds. "Come on," Elena whispered. 7 seconds. 7.2 seconds. That was the exact time of flight. In the silence of the mountain peak, it felt like a lifetime. Elena did not blink. She kept her eye pressed to the scope, watching the tiny drama unfold miles away through the lens. Down in the valley, the terrorist leader had just slid into the back seat of the armored SUV. The heavy door was swinging shut. To the naked eye, nothing had happened. The wind was still blowing dust across the road. The chaotic gunfire from the ambush site was still echoing off the canyon walls. Then, the laws of physics delivered their verdict. The rear window of the SUV did not shatter. It vaporized. The .408 solid copper projectile, still traveling at supersonic speed and carrying enough kinetic energy to crack an engine block, struck the ballistic glass. The reinforced laminate, designed to stop assault rifle fire at close range, failed catastrophically against the heavy sniper round. A cloud of white dust, pulverized glass, and metal erupted from the side of the vehicle. "Impact," Davis whispered, his voice cracking. "Target. Target is down." Inside the vehicle, the result was absolute. The round had passed through the glass, through the target, and out the other side, burying itself in the vehicle's frame. The driver, panicked by the sudden explosion of gore in the back seat and the disintegration of the window, jerked the steering wheel violently to the right. The heavy SUV swerved, tires screeching in a sound that didn't reach Elena's ears. It jumped the low berm on the side of the road and slammed nose first into a jagged limestone outcrop. Steam hissed from the crushed radiator, mixing with the dust. The bodyguards standing outside froze. They looked at the wrecked car, then at the hills, then at each other. They had heard nothing. The bullet had traveled faster than the sound of the gunshot. 3 seconds later, the sound arrived. Boom. The crack of the Chaytak rolled over the valley floor like a peal of thunder. A deep, resonant report that was distinct from the sharp chatter of automatic weapons. It was the voice of judgment from the heavens. The enemy fighters on the ridgeline, who had been gleefully suppressing Miller's team, stopped firing. Heads turned. The confusion was palpable even from 3 miles away. They were looking at the nearby hills, searching for a tank or an airstrike. It did not occur to them to look at the mountain peak hidden in the clouds near the border. "Good kill," Elena said. Her voice was flat, stripped of any triumph. She reached for the bolt handle of her rifle. Cycling. She pulled the bolt back. The massive brass casing, hot and smoking, ejected onto the frozen ground with a metallic cling. She pushed the bolt forward, stripping a fresh round from the magazine and locking it into the chamber. "Davis, report!" she ordered, breaking her spotter out of his stupor. Davis blinked, shaking his head as if waking from a dream. He looked at the wreckage again through his spotting scope. "Confirmed kill. The HVT is—" "He is gone, Elena. That car is a coffin. The enemy is in total disarray. They don't know where the fire came from. On the valley floor, the dynamic had shifted instantly. The sudden, unexplained death of their leader had shattered the enemy's command structure. The RPG teams on the ridge hesitated. The volume of fire directed at the SEALs dropped significantly. The radio crackled. This time, Miller's voice was clear, the interference momentarily cutting through. "Spectre, was that you?" The question hung in the air. The disbelief in his voice was heavy. Miller, a man who had sworn it was physically impossible, a man who had ordered her to stand down, was now staring at the burning wreck of his target and trying to reconcile his reality with what he had just witnessed. "Target neutralized, Highland," Elena replied. "Time of flight 7.2 seconds. Windhold was correct." She didn't wait for his praise. There was no time. The confusion below would only last a moment. The enemy fighters were fanatical. Once the shock wore off, they would turn their rage back on the trapped SEAL team with renewed ferocity. They would want blood for blood. "They are regrouping," Elena observed, shifting her aim away from the burning car and toward the ambush ridge. "Davis, range the RPG team on the east slope. They are about to fire on Miller's position again." "On it," Davis said. His movements were faster now, fueled by adrenaline and a newfound terrifying respect for the woman beside him. "Range is 3,200 meters. Angle is steep. Wind is still holding steady." Elena adjusted her scope. The previous shot had been a surgical strike, a feat of mathematics. Now, the surgery was over. The butchery was about to begin. She wasn't just a sniper anymore. She was the SEAL team's guardian angel, and she had a magazine full of thunderbolts. "Miller, keep your heads down," Elena broadcasted. "I am clearing the road." Down in the valley, the SEALs pressed themselves into the dirt, listening to the impossible voice in their earpieces. They didn't understand how she had done it. They didn't care. They just knew that the little librarian on the mountain had just punched a ticket for the devil, and she wasn't finished yet. Elena took a breath. The crosshairs settled on the chest of a man loading a fresh rocket into his launcher. "Sending," she whispered. The bullet arrived with the inevitability of a natural disaster. The RPG gunner on the eastern ridge never heard the shot. One moment, he was adjusting the sights of his launcher. aiming down at the cluster of rocks where Miller was pinned. The next, he was simply erased from the battlefield. The impact of the .408 round at 3,000 meters was catastrophic, flinging the man and his loaded weapon backward into the scree. "Hit! Dead center!" Davis called out, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Next target, machine gun nest, 11 o'clock low." Elena did not pause to celebrate. Her world had become a rhythmic cycle of violence. Recoil, bolt back, eject, bolt forward, acquire, breathe, squeeze. The Chaytak M200 was not designed for rapid fire. It was a precision instrument, heavy and stiff, requiring deliberate force to cycle the action. But Elena worked the bolt with a fluidity that defied the weapon's mechanics. Her small hand gripped the oversized bolt handle, jerking it back violently to eject the spent casing. The hot brass spun through the air, landing on the frozen rock with a sharp clink that sounded like a metronome counting down the enemy's lifespan. Clink. Windage holding. "Send it," Davis spotted. Crack. Another 7-second wait. Another enemy fighter crumpled. Down in the valley, the dynamic was changing. The enemy fighters, initially confused by the death of their leader, now realized they were being hunted. They saw the puffs of dust erupting on their ridgeline. They saw their comrades dropping without a sound. "They see us," Davis warned, shrinking lower behind his spotting scope. "They are traversing the DSHK." On the far ridge, the heavy machine gun that had been suppressing the SEALs swung upward, its barrel elevating toward the distant mountain peak. Flashes of light sparkled from the enemy position. Moments later, the air around Elena and Davis hissed as heavy 12.7mm rounds slashed through the space around them. Most fell short, tumbling into the abyss below, but a few struck the rock face beneath their ledge, sending stone splinters flying. "Ignore it," Elena said, her voice devoid of fear. "They are firing blind. The angle is too steep for them." She didn't flinch. She kept her eye pressed to the scope, hunting for the greatest threat. Below, Lieutenant Commander Miller was shouting orders, trying to rally his team. He broke cover, limping on his injured leg, trying to drag a wounded radio man to better cover. "RPG!" someone screamed over the comms. Elena saw it before they did. A second RPG gunner had popped up from a spider hole, directly flanking Miller's position. He shouldered the tube, the warhead pointing straight at the exposed commander. Miller saw the man too. He raised his rifle, but he was off balance, his leg buckling. He knew he was too slow. He stared death in the face, bracing for the impact. "Not today," Elena whispered. She didn't wait for Davis to call the wind. She knew the wind now. It was in her blood. She adjusted her aim slightly right, leading the target, and pulled the trigger. The recoil punished her shoulder, which was already throbbing with a deep, dull ache. Miller watched the RPG gunner flinch. A split second later, the man's chest exploded in a pink mist. The rocket launcher fell from his hands, discharging harmlessly into the dirt. The thunderous boom of Elena's shot rolled over the valley seconds later, a delayed announcement of salvation. Miller froze. He looked up, not at the enemy, but higher. He looked past the ridgeline, past the clouds, toward the invisible peak of Point Zulu. "Spectre," Miller breathed, the name no longer a mockery. He remembered the briefing room. He remembered mocking her size, her rifle, her silence. "I carry it with my will," she had said. He felt a wave of shame so acute it nearly brought him to his knees. The useless, heavy equipment he had tried to leave behind was the only reason he was still breathing. The little girl he had tried to sideline was currently fighting an entire battalion alone to keep him alive. "Commander, move!" Elena's voice cut through his earpiece, sharp and commanding. I have suppressed the East Ridge. You have a 30-second window to cross the gap. Move your team now. Miller snapped back to reality. The shame would have to wait. Survival came first. You heard her, Miller roared at his men, pain forgotten. Move! Go! 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 The SEALs surged forward, their movement covered by the rhythmic, thunderous cadence of the guardian angel on the mountain. Clink. Bolt back, clack. Bolt forward, boom! Elena fired again and again. She was drawing fire, making herself the most dangerous thing on the battlefield, daring the enemy to look at her instead of the retreating Americans. Heat warning, Davis said, glancing at the barrel. Mirage is getting bad. Let it burn, Elena replied, chambering another round. We aren't done yet. The rifle was no longer a cold, precision instrument. It was a living, breathing beast that radiated heat like a furnace. The heavy, fluted barrel of the Chaytak, designed to dissipate thermal energy, was overwhelmed. Elena could see the heat waves rising from the steel in shimmering ripples, dancing in front of her objective lens. This barrel mirage was a sniper's nightmare, distorting the image of the valley below like a reflection in a disturbed pond. The enemy soldiers looked like swimming ghosts, their outlines blurring and shifting. I can't get a clean reading, Davis shouted over the wind, his eye pressed to the spotting scope. The heat is too bad. You are shooting through soup. I don't need a clean reading, Elena gritted out. I just need a silhouette. She didn't wait for the wind call. She timed the distortion, waiting for the image to settle for a fraction of a second. She found the machine gunner who had replaced the previous one on the DSHK, crack. The recoil slammed into her shoulder again. It wasn't a kick anymore. It felt like a sledgehammer breaking bone. The heavy rubber butt pad of the rifle had dug a deep groove into her deltoid muscle. She knew, without looking, that the skin underneath her uniform was bruised purple and likely bleeding. Every trigger pull sent a shock wave of agony down her spine, rattling her teeth. But she didn't stop. To stop was to let Miller die. Target down, Davis confirmed. But you are drifting right. You are flinching, Elena. Correcting, she whispered. She forced her body to relax, fighting the biological urge to recoil from the pain. She pressed the bruise harder into the stock, embracing the hurt. The magazine clicked empty. The bolt locked back on an empty chamber. Dry, she announced. Reload. Davis reached for his pack, but Elena shook her head. No time for a mag swap. Hand me the loose rounds. Davis scrambled, grabbing a handful of the massive .408 cartridges from the open ammunition box. He placed one directly into her open palm. Elena's fingers were stiff with cold and trembling with fatigue, but her muscle memory was flawless. She guided the single round into the ejection port, sliding the bolt forward with a heavy metallic clack. She locked the handle down. In the valley, the SEALs were moving faster now, emboldened by the inexplicable thunder from the sky. They were bounding from cover to cover, their return fire becoming more organized as the enemies withered. But there was still one obstacle. A sniper team on the far side of the canyon, well hidden in a rock fissure, was taking potshots at the retreating Americans. I see him, Elena said. The heat mirage made the enemy sniper look like a wavering blob, but she saw the muzzle flash. She inhaled. The smell of burnt propellant was thick in her nose, choking and sharp. It was the smell of violence. She centered the crosshairs, compensating for the heat distortion by aiming slightly low. She squeezed the trigger. Boom. The impact was brutal. The rifle jumped, and a sharp gasp of pain escaped Elena's lips. She felt something wet trickle down her shoulder blade, blood from where the recoil had finally broken the skin. "Miss," Davis called out. "High and right. He's still active." "Load me," Elena commanded, ignoring the failure. She racked the bolt back, ejecting the expensive brass into the snow. Davis placed another round in the chamber. "Last one, Elena. Make it count." She closed her eyes for a second. The pain in her shoulder was a screaming white noise. She pushed it into a box in her mind and locked the lid. She wasn't a body anymore. She was just an eye and a finger. She opened her eyes. The enemy sniper had popped up again, confident after her miss. He was lining up a shot on the rear guard of the SEAL team. "Not today," she breathed. She didn't fight the gun this time. She let the recoil happen before it happened. She fired. The round crossed the 3-mile void. It punched through the rock cover and took the enemy sniper in the shoulder, spinning him out of the fissure and down the cliff face. "Hit!" Davis yelled, slamming his hand on the rock. "Target eliminated. The ridge is clear." I repeat, "The ridge is clear." Elena didn't cheer. She simply opened the bolt, leaving the chamber empty. She lowered her head onto the stock, her chest heaving against the cold stone. 13 shots, 13 threats removed from existence. Below, the SEAL team had crossed the danger zone. They were disappearing into the defilade of the extraction route, leaving the carnage behind them. The valley floor was silent again, save for the crackle of burning vehicles. "They made it," Davis said, his voice soft with awe. He looked at Elena. She looked small again, huddled over the massive gun, shivering slightly as the adrenaline crash began to set in. "Clear the area," Elena whispered, her voice hoarse. "We have to move before they find the range." She tried to push herself up, but her right arm refused to respond. It hung limp, numb and throbbing at the same time. "I've got you," Davis said. He didn't wait for permission. He grabbed the heavy rifle with one hand and offered her his other arm. This time there was no hesitation, no judgment. Just the reverence of a soldier helping a warrior to their feet. The mountain, having served as their fortress for the last 20 hours, was rapidly turning into a trap. The silence that followed Elena's final shot was deceptive. It was merely the deep breath the enemy took before screaming back. "Incoming!" Davis roared, tackling Elena into the shallow depression behind a slab of granite. The warning was punctuated by a whistling shriek that terminated in a violent, earth-shaking crump. A mortar round slammed into the ridgeline 50 meters to their left, sending a geyser of shale and dirty snow into the air. The enemy had finally triangulated the source of the thunder. They were no longer shooting blindly with machine guns. They were walking mortar fire across the peaks. "They are bracketing us!" Davis shouted, scrambling to his feet as the debris rained down on their helmets like hail. "We have to move! Shoot and scoot, Spectre, now!" Elena tried to stand, but her body rebelled. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the 13 shots was evaporating, leaving behind a wreck of torn muscle and exhaustion. Her right arm hung uselessly at her side, the shoulder joint feeling like it was filled with broken glass. When she reached for the Pelican case to pack the rifle, her fingers couldn't close around the handle. "Leave the case," she gasped, pain stripping the color from her face. "Just grab the rifle." She tried to sling the 30-pound weapon over her good shoulder, but the weight nearly pulled her off balance. Another mortar round landed closer, the concussion pressing against her chest like a physical hand. "Give it to me." It wasn't a request. Davis stepped in, stripping the massive Chaytak from her grasp with a gentleness that contradicted the urgency of the moment. 2 days ago, he had called it a toy. Now he handled the weapon with the reverence due a religious artifact. He slung it across his own back, over his radio pack, taking on the crushing weight without a flinch. "I've got the heavy," Davis said, his eyes locking onto hers through the dust. "You just move. Can you walk?" "I can run," Elena lied. "Then run." They abandoned the hide site, leaving behind the empty brass casings and the indentations of their bodies in the frozen gravel. They dropped off the exposed ridgeline, sliding down the steep scree slope on the leeward side of the mountain. The descent was a controlled fall. Elena's boots scrabbled for purchase on the loose rock, her knees jarring with every impact. Behind them, the summit of Point Zulu vanished in a series of explosions. The enemy was pounding the empty nest with a fury that would have vaporized them had they lingered 30 seconds longer. Pain became Elena's entire world. Every step sent a jolt through her injured shoulder, but the fear of letting Davis down, of becoming the liability Miller had predicted, drove her forward. She focused on the back of Davis's boots, following his path through the labyrinth of rock and ice. For an hour, they moved in a grueling silence, putting vertical distance between themselves and the mortars. The air grew thicker, richer with oxygen as they descended, but the temperature rose, turning the frozen ground into slick mud. "Rally Point Alpha is 2 clicks east," Davis called back, checking his wrist GPS without breaking stride. "We are clear of the kill box." They slowed to a tactical walk as they entered the tree line. The cover of the pine forest offered a psychological safety that the bare rock lacked. Elena leaned against a tree for a moment, gasping for air. Her vision swam, black spots dancing at the edges. "Drink," Davis said, shoving a canteen into her good hand. She took a swallow. The water was warm and tasted of plastic, but it was life. She looked at Davis. The big SEAL was sweating profusely, carrying nearly 150 pounds of combined gear, but he looked at her with a grin that split his dirty face. That was... He paused, searching for the word. "That was some cowboy shit, Spectre. I've never seen a bolt run that hot." "Just doing my job, Chief," Elena murmured, handing the canteen back. "No." Davis shook his head, adjusting the strap of her rifle on his shoulder. "You did our job, and you did it better." They pushed on. The shadows lengthened as evening approached. Finally, through the gaps in the trees, they saw the glint of an Igor strobe flashing in the twilight. Rally Point Alpha. As they broke into the small clearing, 6 figures rose from the undergrowth. It was Miller and the rest of the team. They were battered, bandaged, and covered in the dust of the valley, but they were alive. The conversation in the clearing stopped instantly. 6 pairs of eyes turned to the 2 figures emerging from the woods. They looked at Davis, hulking under the weight of the massive sniper rifle. Then they looked at the small, pale woman walking beside him, clutching her shoulder, looking like she might blow away in a strong breeze. There were no cheers, no high fives, just a heavy, profound silence as the men who had survived the valley stared at the ghost who had saved them. Miller stepped forward, his limp pronounced. He looked at Davis, then at the rifle, and finally he fixed his gaze on Elena. "Status?" Miller asked, his voice raspy. "We are green, sir," Davis answered for her, stepping up to stand protectively at her side. "The asset is secure, and the debt is paid." Elena just nodded, too tired to speak. She let her back slide down the rough bark of a pine tree, sitting on the damp needles. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind in the branches, no longer needing to calculate its velocity. The clearing at Rally Point Alpha was submerged in a twilight that felt less like the end of a day and more like the end of a world. The sun had dipped below the jagged peaks to the west, painting the snow on the higher elevations in violent strokes of crimson and violet. Down here in the pines, the shadows were long and cold. Elena sat at the base of the tree, her knees drawn up to her chest, trying to conserve warmth. Her right arm was numb, a dead weight resting in her lap. The adrenaline crash was brutal. She felt hollowed out, as if the 13 shots had taken pieces of her soul with them. Around her, the seals moved with the subdued quiet of men who had looked into the abyss and barely scrambled back. They were checking each other for wounds, repacking gear, and drinking water, but the usual post-contact banter, the adrenaline-fueled jokes and bravado, was absent. Every few seconds, eyes would dart toward her. They were quick, furtive glances. These men, giants in their field, capable of underwater demolition and close-quarters combat that would terrify a normal soldier, seemed suddenly unsure of the social geometry. They had spent the last 48 hours treating her like luggage. Now, they were painfully aware that the luggage had teeth. A shadow fell over her. Elena looked up. It was the team medic, a lanky man named Sorensen. He didn't say a word. He simply knelt beside her, his movements gentle. He reached out and touched her shoulder, the one that had absorbed the punishment of the Chaitak. Elena winced, a sharp intake of breath hissing through her teeth. "Let me see," Sorensen murmured. He unzipped the top of her tactical shirt, peeling back the fabric to reveal the skin. Even in the dim light, the bruising was horrific, a deep, angry purple bloom that spread across her deltoid and up toward her neck. The skin was broken in a crescent shape, where the butt pad had bitten deep. "You tore the muscle fibers," Sorensen said clinically, applying a cold pack from his kit. "And the recoil broke some capillaries. You are going to look like you went 10 rounds with a truck for the next month." "It was worth it," Elena said softly. "Yeah," Sorensen paused, taping the pack in place. He looked her in the eye for the first time. "Yeah, it was. Thanks, Spectre." He moved away, leaving her alone again. But the ice had been broken. From the other side of the clearing, Lieutenant Commander Miller stood up. He had been sitting on a log, getting his own leg wound dressed. He limped slightly as he walked toward her, the sound of his boots crunching on the pine needles drawing the attention of the entire team. The silence in the clearing deepened. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Miller stopped 3 feet from her. He looked down. He was a proud man, a career officer with a chest full of ribbons, and admitting a mistake of this magnitude was not in his nature. He looked at the woman who was barely half his weight, huddled against the tree. Elena started to push herself up to stand at attention, but Miller raised a hand, stopping her. "Stay down, Ensign," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel tumbling in a mixer. He stared at her for a long moment, searching for words that wouldn't sound patronizing or insufficient. "How do you apologize for nearly getting your team killed because of prejudice? How do you thank someone for doing the impossible after you told them it couldn't be done?" "That shot," Miller began, then stopped. He shook his head, looking toward the dark mountain peak in the distance. 3.8 clicks, in a crosswind. "The wind has a rhythm, sir," Elena said, her voice steady. "You just have to listen to it." Miller looked back at her. A faint, wry smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I guess I was doing too much talking to hear it." He didn't say, "I'm sorry." In their world, Apologies were words, and words were cheap. Instead, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a patch, the unit patch of his team, the one usually reserved only for those who had completed the grueling selection course. He didn't hand it to her. He leaned down and pressed it firmly onto the Velcro panel of her shoulder sleeve, right over the bandage. "We ride together," Miller said. It was an acceptance. It was a validation. He straightened up and stepped back, snapping a sharp salute. It wasn't the perfunctory salute of an officer to a subordinate. It was the slow, deliberate salute of a warrior to a peer. Around the clearing, the other SEALs stopped what they were doing. One by one, they turned toward her. Davis, Sorensen, the others. They didn't salute, but they nodded. Solemn, heavy nods that carried more weight than any medal. Elena felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't want the glory. She didn't want the attention. But this silent circle of respect, was something she hadn't realized she needed. "Inbound!" the radio man shouted, breaking the spell. "Dust off in 2 mics!" The rhythmic thumping of rotor blades grew from a whisper to a roar. The heavy Chinook helicopter crested the tree line, its searchlight cutting through the gloom like a divine eye. The trees bowed under the wash, whipping snow and pine needles into a frenzy. Davis appeared at her side again, hoisting the massive rifle case. He offered her a hand. "Ready to go home, Spectre?" Elena took his hand. She pulled herself up, the pain in her shoulder sharp but distant. She looked at the mountain one last time, the dark silhouette against the dying light. She had left her mark on it, and it had left its mark on her. "Ready," she said. She walked toward the ramp of the helicopter, stepping into the wash, leaving the silence behind. The debriefing room at the Joint Task Force headquarters was a different kind of battlefield, sterile and cold. The air conditioning hummed with a monotonous drone, scrubbing the air of the dust and sweat that defined the world outside. The walls were lined with acoustical foam, absorbing sound, making every voice sound flat and detached. Ensign Elena Vance sat at the far end of the polished mahogany table. Her uniform was fresh, but the way she held her right shoulder, stiff and guarded, betrayed the violence of the last 48 hours. She felt small in the room, surrounded by men with stars and eagles on their collars, men whose war was fought on maps and spreadsheets. At the head of the table, Rear Admiral Holloway tapped a stylus against the glass screen of his tablet. He looked at the after-action report, then looked up at Lieutenant Commander Miller, who stood at attention. "Commander," Holloway began, his tone dry, "I am reading this report, and I see a discrepancy. Paragraph 4, Section 2, engagement distance." "There is no discrepancy, sir," Miller replied, his voice raspy but firm. "It says here," the Admiral continued, circling a number on the digital display, "that the target was neutralized at a distance of 3,800 meters. That is nearly 2.5 miles. I assume this is a typo. Did the typist mean 2,800? A ripple of murmured agreement went through the other officers. A shot at 3.8 kilometers was not just unlikely. In the doctrine of modern warfare, it was considered a statistical anomaly bordering on fiction. "It is not a typo, Admiral," Miller said. He didn't blink. The distance was confirmed by laser rangefinder and satellite grid coordinates. Holloway leaned back, crossing his arms. "Commander, with all due respect to your team, that range exceeds the maximum effective range of the weapon system by over 1,000 meters. You are asking us to believe that a single shooter, in high-altitude storm conditions, made a shot that defies ballistics?" Elena remained silent. She studied the wood grain on the table. She knew this would happen. The math didn't make sense to them because they hadn't felt the wind. They hadn't been in the rhythm. "I am not asking you to believe me, sir," Miller said. He stepped forward and plugged a drive into the main console. "I am asking you to watch." The main screen on the wall flickered to life. It showed the grainy, black and white footage from the gun camera mounted on Elena's CHATAC. The timestamp in the corner ticked by. The crosshairs were steady, aiming at a patch of nothingness high above the target. Then, the recoil shuddered through the frame. The room went silent. The officers watched the timestamp. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. "Flight time is excessive," a colonel muttered. 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 7 seconds. On the screen, the target's vehicle window exploded. The heat signature inside slumped. The vehicle swerved and crashed. The video ended. The frame froze on the burning wreck. "Ballistics data," Miller said, pulling up a second slide. It showed the wind charts, the Coriolis calculations, and the spin drift compensation. Ensign Vance calculated the hold manually after the computer failed. She accounted for a variable wind shear that our own meteorologists missed. Holloway stared at the screen for a long time. The skepticism in the room evaporated, replaced by a heavy, stunned silence. The Admiral looked at Elena. For the first time, he really looked at her, not as a statistic, but as the anomaly itself. "Ensign Vance," Holloway said, "is this accurate?" Elena stood up slowly. Her shoulders screamed in protest, but her face remained a mask of calm. "Yes, Admiral." "You realized that if you had missed, you would have compromised the extraction and likely faced a court-martial for disobeying the initial hold order?" "Yes, Admiral." "And you took the shot anyway?" "I took the shot because the math was solid, sir," Elena said quietly. "And because my team was dying." Holloway nodded slowly. He looked at Miller. "This is a world record, Commander. It eclipses the previous longest confirmed kill by a significant margin. Public affairs will want to run with this. The Ghost of the North. It's good for morale. It's good for funding." Miller looked at Elena. He knew what was coming. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Elena asked. "Granted." "I request that my name be redacted from the public release," Elena said. Her voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the room. "I do not want the press. I do not want the interviews. And I do not want the title." "You are refusing credit for a historic action?" Holloway asked, surprised. "The shot was necessary to save the team, sir," Elena replied. "That is the only credit I require. If you put my face on the news, I become a celebrity. I cannot do my job if I am a celebrity. I need to be invisible." The room was silent again. In a culture that often chased ribbons and headlines, her refusal was more shocking than the shot itself. Holloway looked at her with a newfound respect. He picked up his stylus and made a note on the file. "Very well, Ensign," the Admiral said. "The record will be classified. The shot happened, but officially, it never happened. Is that what you want?" "Yes, sir." Dismissed. Elena saluted. She turned and walked out of the room, her boots making no sound on the carpet. Miller followed her, closing the heavy door behind them, shutting out the noise of the men who tried to measure courage with a ruler. The armory was quiet, a sanctuary of steel and oil hidden away from the noise of the celebratory drinks being poured in the mess hall. The air smelled of Hops No. 9 solvent and cold metal, a scent that Elena found more comforting than any perfume. She sat at a workbench, the CHATAC M200 disassembled before her. The massive barrel, the bolt carrier group, the trigger assembly. She cleaned each piece with the devotion of a watchmaker. Her right shoulder was heavily taped, the bruise beneath throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache, but her hands were steady. The repetitive motion of scrubbing carbon from the bolt face was a meditation, a way to wipe away the memories of the valley just as she wiped away the residue of the powder. Outside these walls, the base was buzzing. Rumors had legs, and the story of the impossible shot was already mutating into myth. Some said it was a drone strike. Others whispered about a secret weapon test. A few, the ones who had seen the medevac chopper land, spoke of a small woman with eyes like ash. Elena didn't care about the stories. Stories faded. The rifle remained. The heavy steel door of the armory creaked open. Elena didn't look up, but she knew the gait. The limp was slight, barely noticeable now, but distinctive. "You're missing the party, Spectre," Lieutenant Commander Miller said, closing the door behind him. The sudden silence that followed felt heavy, intimate. "I don't do parties, sir," Elena replied, running an oiled patch through the chamber. "And I have a transport leaving at 0500. Miller walked over to the workbench. He was out of his combat gear, dressed in clean fatigues, but he looked older than he had 3 days ago. The mountains had taken something from him, just as they had taken something from her. He watched her hands move for a moment, admiring the efficiency. "The Admiral sealed the file," Miller said quietly. "Your name is buried. As far as the Pentagon is concerned, that HVT died of natural causes, rapid onset lead poisoning." "Good," Elena said. She reassembled the bolt, sliding it into the receiver with a solid, final clunk. "The boys are asking about you," Miller continued. "Davis wanted to buy you a beer. Sorensen wanted to check your shoulder again. They feel bad that you're down here alone." "I'm not alone, Commander." Elena patted the stock of the rifle. "I'm just preparing for the next one." Miller sighed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He placed it on the workbench, right next to the muzzle brake of the Chaytak. It was a challenge coin. Heavy brass, weathered, not the shiny souvenir kind sold at the PX. On one side was the Navy SEAL trident. On the other, the specific skull and crossbones emblem of his squadron. It was a token that couldn't be bought, only earned in blood. "We don't usually give these to outsiders," Miller said, his voice thick with emotion. "In fact, it's against regulation. But then again, hitting a man at 3.8 clicks is against the laws of physics." Elena stopped wiping the barrel. She looked at the coin, then up at Miller. "You aren't an outsider anymore, Elena," Miller said, using her name with a solemn gravity. "You're one of us. Wherever you go, whatever unit you attach to next, you have brothers here. Remember that." Elena reached out and picked up the coin. The metal was cool against her palm, grounding her. It was heavy, heavier than the metal she would likely never receive. "Thank you, James," she whispered. Miller nodded once, a sharp, definitive gesture. He didn't say goodbye. In their line of work, goodbyes were bad luck. He simply turned and walked out of the armory, leaving her to the silence she cherished. Elena finished reassembling the rifle. She packed it into the Pelican case, locking the latches with a series of loud snaps. She slipped the coin into her breast pocket, directly over her heart. She shouldered her pack, wincing slightly as the strap settled over her bruise. She turned off the lights, plunging the room into darkness. Outside, the night air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of snow from the distant peaks. Elena walked toward the flight line, moving through the shadows between the hangars. She avoided the pools of light, sticking to the darkness where she belonged. She was not the hero they would write books about. She was not the face on the recruitment poster. She was the wind on the mountain, the silence between the heartbeats, the ghost that watched over the wolves. And that was enough. Elena Spectre Vance boarded the transport plane, disappearing into the belly of the machine, leaving the legend behind to grow on its own while she moved on to the next mountain, the next weight, and the next impossible shot.